been a long drive this morning on an incredibly wet March day here in Scotland. I'm a few miles past Oban, trekking along the coast in this kind of broken, hilly country, craggy outcrops above me. It's sort of that typical land that you would imagine sheep being. In fact, there are sheep everywhere. It's kind of sheep farming country is what I describe it as, but the sea is just to my right. And I'm here to meet Dr. James Fenton, who is a man I think is going to raise as many questions as he answers for me, but I've read a lot of his papers. He has a lot of very insightful views on carbon and tree planting and tree coverage across Scotland historically, what the future is going to look like, which ticks a lot of the boxes of my adventure and exploration into the uplands here and what they're going to look like in the future. This is the British Uplands Podcast with Byron Pace and Sarah Roberts, an exploration of change in one of the UK's most important landscapes.
Grant to take down trees, plant to put hedges, grant to dig ditches, plants put on sheep, no grants for sheep, sheep come off.
If you hear a simple argument put forward about how the uplands need to be managed, then that simple argument has to be wrong.
Definitely going to cut that out of the podcast. I think I'm here. He said the house that looks like it has a church door. And that certainly looks like a church door. So I've arrived. Hello.
Hello, come in.
I'm here to see James. I'm assuming I got the right door.
Yes.
James, nice to meet you.
You to be late, don't worry.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry about that.
I'm a botanist by training. After leaving school, I did a degree in botany at Durham University. And David Bellamy was
famous David Bellamy.
He was one of my lecturers and a
No
key
way.
influence in my life.
Okay.
And his main interest was peat bogs. So I've always had, even before that, I always had interest in peat bogs. And a job came up with the British Antarctic Survey studying Antarctic peat. Because most people probably don't know that in Antarctica, there's peat bogs, well, it's under permafrost, but there's peat up to 5,000 years old.
Our carbon-rich peatlands, once also covered by ice, are now exposed to a changing climate and the impacts of human intervention. Many want to see more trees planted in the uplands, but why aren't there more already?
The climate warms after an ice age, and the soils are rich because all the rock flour and the grinding of glaciers have made nice rich soils. The climate warms up quite quickly, optimum for plants, quick colonization of plants and trees migrate up, and you get woodland. And that's called the mesocratic phase of maximum diversity.
So how far back are we from present day to when you're talking about that?
About 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago.
Okay.
But in this part of the world, it rains. And it rains, and it rains.
Case in point today.
Exactly.
Yes.
And what does rain do? It washes out nutrients. So it's a natural process of woodland expansion and woodland decline. And we've come to near the end point of a natural decline of woodland, and we are trying to reverse our natural process by putting woodland back in the landscape.
So Dr. Fenton argues that the historic lack of nutrients in our uplands is the main reason for limited tree cover. But humans have had a massive impact on the landscape as well. Our peatlands have been used for fuel, farming and forestry, to name just a few.
Peat cutting has been the biggest change to peatlands and the massive loss in Scotland in the last few thousand years, which isn't recorded hugely, doesn't get much discussion. The other one is draining, digging ditches, which they were called moor grips. And the theory was if you drain peat, it makes it better grazing or better for grouse shooting. And all over Britain, the Pennines, and in even quite remote parts of Scotland, you could get a grant to take a caterpillar tractor up and dig ditches. And you see them even in quite remote areas. It never worked, because if you know about
This
peat,
was part of agricultural, part of the agricultural schemes back in the
1950s, yeah.
It was from the 50s.
I think so. I've got exactly 50s, 60s, yeah.
Yeah,
You
so
could
there
be
were-
grant aided to dig ditches in peat bog. In the old days, people got grants to drive diggers to dig ditches, and their sons or grandsons now get money to fill them in again.
Yeah.
I think a lot of grant schemes in the countryside are just putting back the damage from previous ones. You used to get grants for cutting down hedges, now you get grants for putting them back. And I think on a fundamental point, virtually all land use change or landscape change in Britain is funded by grant aid. Landowners and owners and managers go the way the grant goes. You grant to plant trees, grant to take down trees, plant to put hedges, grant to dig ditches, and that's generally the grants put on sheep, no grants for sheep come off. That generally is the main determinant of the landscape pattern in Britain today.
And the current direction from government is for greater tree coverage, both through tree planting and natural regeneration or rewilding. This often involves fencing out wild deer or vastly reducing the numbers through culling.
But you said the word natural regeneration. There's nothing natural about making a whole trophic level, making all the grazing level functionally extinct.
That's a great point, yeah.
If you make it
that is the phrase that gets used, I suppose, as well. Yeah.
But it's not natural. You can say it's forced regeneration. There's nothing natural about low grazing levels. And I think this is where an understanding of ecology comes in. There's debate to be had. What determines the grazing level in a natural ecosystem? Is it predation or is it food availability? Now, I would argue that, and other people, ecologists who've studied deer, say that it's the food availability determines the population of animals. Obviously, there's got to be enough food, and animals will eat. If there's a lot of grazing available, numbers will increase to utilise that grazing. And therefore, the grazing level is determined ultimately about the food availability. Now, of course, in Scotland, highly seasonal climate, there's a lot of grazing available in the summer, less in the winter. So it's winter availability of food that determines the grazing level. And all research shows that the 10, 13, 20 deer per square kilometre, can be supported naturally. You might get high mortality some years. But to get trees, you need 3 or 4 deer per kilometre or less. So that order of magnitude discrepancy between the carrying capacity and that for woodland shows you need to think again. Why are you going for woodland? Surely, if the carrying capacity is such that woodland cannot survive, why do you expect woodland to survive?
Of course, tree planting schemes, which are restoring some of our ancient woodlands around the UK, are crucially important for the health and biodiversity of our natural spaces. The Woodland Trust is currently working with landowners around the country to restore more than 34,000 hectares of damaged woodlands, removing invasive, non-native species. But in the uplands, there are some difficult decisions to be made.
So everybody talks about wants a balance. We don't want all woodland, we don't want all open hill, we want a balance. And I would argue that's nothing to do with ecology or science of what the natural world would give us. That relates to our psychological needs or liking.
So it's more like a sociological desire rather than it is an ecological requirement.
And that actually means that we tend to transform the landscape into what we like. And because humans are the same much across the world, we result in a homogenization of landscapes. We make everywhere a balance, woodland, open ground. So we make everywhere the same. Now, I don't even know about the European Landscape Convention. It's a convention from the Council of Europe about looking after landscape. And one of the issues there is the homogenization of landscapes, making everywhere look the same, because each landscape is distinctive. And in terms of urban variety, the building structure in Athens is different to it is in London. But with modern sort of supermarkets and shops, they all look the same everywhere in the world. The same applies to landscapes. And, every so often, let's make Scotland like Norway, more trees. So if we cover Scotland with trees and make it like Norway, we're actually homogenizing the European landscapes, and we've lost that diversity.
So we might have more diversity in our landscape, potentially, but in a global context, we've lost.
That's it, exactly that. And most people don't think globally. Because we think, because we live in a small geographical area as a rule, and we get to know it well. And things which are rare in our area, we appreciate. Things which are common, we don't. But there's two conflicting narratives, or value systems, if you like. There's a nature conservation value system, conserving natural processes in nature.
And the biodiversity loss conversation.
And there's a climate change one. Mm-hmm. And they're not always on the same side. An example might be climate change. You want to build wind farms and dam rivers and hydroelectric schemes, which might be in conflict with maintaining the naturalness of a landscape. So, which is more, society has to decide what's more important, keeping some parts of the planet wild, so future generations can see nature in the raw and understand how nature works, or is that less important than making sure that we extract every last kilowatt of energy from natural energy flows and cover the landscape with infrastructure? And that's a societal decision, and the different value systems, as comparing apples and oranges.
That was a scientific view of how our landscape was shaped, but it sustains more than just deer and peat bogs. And so this week we wanted to hear those voices, the people who live and work here.
You don't have to work hard to convert people that eat meat to eating game. They tend to try it, enjoy it, like it, buy it.
To kick us off, Sarah is going to lighten our discussion a little. And there is no better way to do that than with food, as she joins game chef, writer and broadcaster Tim Madams, cooking up a feast in his kitchen, nestled on the edge of the very uplands we have been investigating.
So I've got a little roe deer haunch here, and I am literally just going to seam it out. So I'm going to take, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to take this muscle here out, and we're going to slice it up into a couple of steaks. I'm just going to grill it while we have a chat, or just fry it while we have a little chat, and we'll make a little asparagus, salady kind of dish with some cheese and a bit of venison.
Sounds absolutely
all right.
Delicious.
Will that do you? Is that good?
That'll do.
Doesn't sound very snappy on the menu, does it?
So why is it important, in your opinion, that people eat more game?
I think it would be nice to see more people eating the right game. I mean, venison's a good example because obviously, there's a drive UK-wide to reduce the national deer herd, if you like. There's never been more deer in the UK. That's causing problems, coming into conflict with forestry, coming into conflict with road users, coming into conflict with people in all sorts of different ways. Particularly if you want to grow lots of new trees, particularly in areas where it's difficult to fence them, then deer are not your friend. If you're a young tree, you're going to get eaten by a deer. And understories of woodlands suffering quite a lot as well with overpopulation of deer. So things like nightingale habitat, that sort of thing, is getting lost because we're over-browsing the woodland floor. So that sort of understory of stuff that you would normally get in a mature woodland is not there.
Yes.
That's one of the reasons I would like to see people eating more of it, because we need to kill more of it and reduce that herd. So one of the ways I like to look at it is if I choose not to eat meat, which I may well do one day. I think I have a lot of respect for anyone that thinks enough about their diet that they make a decision like that. I'm behind them because I wish people thought more about what they eat. That's my own thinking on that. But if you choose not to eat meat, over the course of your lifetime, you stop buying lamb chops, a couple of lambs will eventually not be born to produce food for you, right? That sort of works in my head. Deer, these are going to get killed anyway, so to not eat them is kind of madness. Now, that's not me saying vegetarians should eat venison. What I'm saying is, if we're going to kill these deer, they must be eaten.
Yeah. There's the wastage issue.
Yeah, can't. And it's a fantastic wild resource. It comes from a beautiful place. It's had no drugs. It's not had antibiotics in its life ever. It's been born in the wild. It's been reared in the wild. And until the moment someone pulls a trigger, it's had a freer life than I have.
Yes.
So I think it's a fantastic thing. And I would encourage people, if they eat meat, to try venison.
How important would you say the uplands in their current state are for the wild food industry?
Well, I mean, I think the uplands in their current state are magnificent places. That's what I think. I mean, if you talk about the wilderness in terms of, extracting wild food from a habitat, then what you need is an incredibly diverse place, and that for me is what managed upland habitats look like. If you want to go and see rare birds in the spring that are ground nesting, that's an amazing place to go and see them. So I think that angle is there. In terms of managing the upland purely for the extraction of wild food, I think they do it quite well. They're keen to, whoever they are, keen to have more trees, and that means less deer. Yeah. But aside from that, I mean, that's a relatively easy change to machinate. We know how to kill deer, we know how to hunt them, and if we're quick and clever, we can probably market that quite well to an end user as well. So, I mean, I was sort of a little bit of the feeling that it isn't broken, don't tinker with it too much. You know, I mean, interesting work being done on peatland restoration and all of that stuff, and there's always things that can be improved. But do I think they're doing a bad job of producing wild food in the uplands of the United Kingdom? No, I don't. I think they're doing a good job.
So the problem actually, if there is a problem, and we are, you know, we're getting this extra venison, for example, flooding the market right now because we want to bring those numbers down. The problem isn't necessarily in the production side of it, it's in the marketing and the sales.
Yeah, and I think the third sector can help with that too. You know, and there's an awful lot of people out there who are struggling to feed themselves, be they homeless, lost their business in a pandemic, just struggling through the cost of living crisis, whatever it is, whatever the reasons are. Frankly, the reasons don't matter. If the people out there that need good quality food, high nutrient dense food, then the third sector is helping. So the Country Food Trust are feeding millions of people with wild venison from the UK, and they're doing that for nothing on charitable funds that they've raised. You know, we can do more of that. So there doesn't need to be any waste. If we want more trees and we need to kill deer on the uplands to have more trees, and that's not going to displace too many other precious rare species by foresting an area that's not then an appropriate habitat for them, then, you know, there are lots of ways that we can be clever about making sure that that meat asset gets used.
Yes.
Not just in the traditional way, not just in homes, not just in restaurants, but hospitals, ration packs, long life food for people in need, third sector. You know, there's lots of ways we can do that.
Yeah. And what about the future, I guess, of grouse and other birds that require the open space?
Well, I mean, if you forest the grouse more, you lose the grouse. Yeah. You know, capercaillie, black grouse, you know, we're losing habitat for them left, right and centre. Now, the capercaillie is quite happy with the trees, you know. There's probably more of a predation issue there. But I think in terms of losing grouse, red grouse entirely, which is an endemic species to the United Kingdom, doesn't exist in this exact form anywhere else in the world. It's a very rare bird globally, right? To do away with that for the sake of planting more trees on the uplands, you know, who's got the answer? I don't have the answer. Is that the right thing to do? Is it the wrong thing to do?
It's almost a matter of opinion. Depending on what you're bringing in and what you're losing, it's a very hard balancing act.
I think it depends what you want.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? I mean, I would like to see uplands with grouse moor on them, and I like to see that habitat thriving because that's a habitat I love and I like it, and I like the products that are coming from it as well. So I love eating grouse, I love eating venison. Until there was a ban on mountain hare, I quite liked eating hare as well. So I think, you know, that's what I want. If you envisage the whole world covered with trees on the uplands and that's your vision, then that's what you want.
Yeah.
You know, and I think actually if we can sit down and talk on both sides of that, we might find out we're not so far apart as we were. I mean, they talk about the Great Caledonian Forest, don't they? And it would be fantastic to see more of that coming back. You know, old Scots pine trees, mixed woodland, you know. But when we have this idea of a forest in our head, we always think of a wood.
Yeah.
Well, actually, really, forests were patches of scrub, a few mature trees, then a bit of a meadow, and the ungulates and the animals in there stirring it up and impacting the environment would create these different pockets, and then they would develop and progress. It wasn't just a whole load of mature trees that we think of when we say forest today.
Because that's what we know from the land of forestry. Yeah.
But when I hear people describe a grouse moor as a wildlife desert, I am horrified because it's just a lie. If you can't find wildlife on a grouse moor, you're not looking.
Yeah.
In fact, you're willfully closing your eyes.
Yeah.
Tremendous. I think it's time that you eat some food.
Great.
And you, you're like, can I put the camera down?
And see,
we have
see
to
if
do.
Tim's cooking is actually any good.
Okay.
Oh, I'll get you a knife. I'll get you a knife and fork. I think she likes
Just in case anybody had any questions over whether or not I was vegan, gone out the window now, haven't they? No, it's absolutely delicious. But it is really, 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 I mean, it's just really delicious food.
There is no doubt from Sarah's reaction that the uplands produce some world-class food. Alex Jenkins is the head gamekeeper of a northern estate where the land is primarily managed for grouse shooting.
The vast bulk of the estate is open heather moorland. We go up to about 2,500 feet at the top, and down in the bottom reaches of the estate where we are just now, we've got farmland. It's no arable farmland in our case, it's all grassland. We've got quite a large farming enterprise on the estate as well. We've got a bit of commercial forestry, amenity forestry as well. The commercial forestry is something we've been phasing out in recent years, going to some more native trees.
But how does what you do fit into the broader landscape management up here? Because this kind of landscape that we're sitting in right now is the subject of a lot of conversations like around the world, where it's quite rare habitat. It's ecosystems that we've done all manner of things to, like in decades gone by. When we can get in, like draining of the moors is what I'm thinking of, which was all agricultural stuff, which we can talk about. It's mostly peatlands, which is become a key conversation in the climate change debate. So what is the sort of broader conservation and management play that you're involved in here, beyond just what very simplistically from the outside would be like, well, they're doing whatever they can do just so they can kill some grouse at the end of the day?
Yeah, simple economics, I think, really. The hills in Scotland, you alluded to what we've done in decades, but I mean, even hundreds of years. There's folk have made their living out of these hills for thousands of years, whether that be Highland cattle or sheep after the clearances or deer stalking, or it's simple economics. And I suppose all the conservation work that we do here, there's very little of it funded by the government, very little, if at all. It all comes from private funding. And the driven grouse shooting for a lot of estates facilitates that. You know, it's the one.
So it's the economic system
it's
to
the
pay
economic,
for the broader.
It's the economic driver. The shooting. I mean, to shoot grouse and driven grouse in Scotland or the UK in general is a very expensive thing to do. It's expensive for a reason. It's a very difficult game bird to produce. But that economic benefit from paying guns for a lot of estates, actually the money from that goes into paying the likes of myself, goes into running the estate. They're not cheap things to run by any means. We've got a large farming enterprise here, which in very recent years has been doing okay, but historically hill farming in Scotland's not done very well.
Without subsidies, I don't think
without
it would
subsidies,
really exist,
it's really going to struggle. Yeah. But there's a huge public benefit from having the sheep on the hill. You know,
what's that?
These guys, the sheep are managing the hill in such a way you wouldn't see these sort of broad purple-clad hills were it not for two things really: muirburn and grazing livestock.
After speaking with Alex, Sarah and I travelled a little further north to meet up with ecologist Kathy Main, who is a landowner in the uplands. But not the kind of landowner you may be thinking of. She is a crofter, not a Highland laird.
Hello. Hey Kathy, how are you going? Hello, I see you. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, yes.
There's good hard standing there if you just want to. They're noisy, but they'll get used to it, don't worry.
I'll pull off. So is this your croft, is it?
This is my croft.
Oh, amazing. What a great location.
I know.
Yeah, sorry.
It's a bit cloudy.
Sarah, Kathy,
Hi,
Sarah.
Sarah. Oh, nice to meet you. Sorry.
Come on, dogs. So how big is this area of land that you've got again?
So it's about 32 hectares or 90 acres.
That's
so it's quite
fairly
big.
large.
It's big for a croft. It's really big for a croft.
It's quite a big area, yeah, for you to have to manage.
It's going to be a challenge. And I suppose in some ways that gives me the opportunity to manage it lightly.
Yeah.
And to do lots of environmental things, which, you know, tend to mean leaving it alone.
not doing too much.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah. So, I mean, your background's in ecology, geology. Yes. How do you feel about humans managing the whole of the uplands?
Mixed. The reality is that all of our landscapes in this part of the world have been heavily managed for so long that doing nothing, to my mind, is not responsible, because it's such an incomplete ecosystem. And humans are an integral part of every ecosystem. You know, I think it is dangerous and deluding to take ourselves out of that concept, because we are utterly dependent on ecosystems for our survival.
Yes.
Having said that, you know, the place would be so much the better, the whole planet would be so much the better if we didn't exist.
Yeah. So if we were taking out the equation completely, it wouldn't matter.
Absolutely.
But for our survival...
But if we wish to survive,
yeah,
then we need to make some quite difficult decisions. And doing nothing and allowing this to kind of return in a rather peculiar way, because it will be very incomplete to a natural state. Natural state, of course, not being the same thing, because natural states fluctuate all the time.
Yeah.
Has some very significant impacts, not least culturally, for the people who do belong here, of which I'm not one.
I wasn't going to say anything about the accent.
No, I'm, you know, I come from London.
Yes.
I was brought up in suburban London, but I've been up here since 1988, which is quite a long time now.
Yeah.
And it feels like home to me. But culturally, taking the people out of this landscape would be a kind of ethnic cleansing, which I would find unacceptable. It would be the second clearances, and I'm not the first person to use that term. Mm. And I think that would be a really big mistake, because in terms of sustainable lifestyles, people here have probably amongst the most sustainable lifestyles of the people, anybody in the UK. And the people who are telling us what we should be doing have some of the most unsustainable lifestyles. That's quite galling. Mm. You know, most people here don't have fancy holidays abroad, don't take flights, don't consume and spend in the same way that people in urban settings do.
Yep.
They eat off the land, they live off the land. It's a very sustainable way of life. And culturally, it's really important. There's language, there's history, it's just critical. And if you try and do it, people will revolt. Mm. And then, you know, there's already mutterings of discontent about green lairds and rewilding and all of those sorts of
big charities, organisations coming in and buying up swaths of land and making
effectively taking the people away from it.
Yeah.
Taking away their jobs, taking away the things that allow them to continue to be here.
We have heard today from some of the people who live and work in the uplands. Later on in this series, we will meet others who would like to see the end of grouse moors, some who want to see an increase in upland tree planting, and others who would rather nature just find its own way. Join us next week as we explore one of the most controversial topics, muirburn. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and visit the webpage www.britishuplands.com to keep up to date and get in touch with any questions. You can also email info@britishuplands.com.
The British Upland series is presented by Byron Pace and Sarah Roberts, co-produced and edited by David Shanks as part of the Into the Wilderness podcast, an MH Studios production.